Okay, thank you, Joe. I'd like to just start by giving you a little bit of history about how I learned about the sanctuary model. This was back in 2013, and I was up in Duluth at MacMap annual conference for community mental health centers. And a Dr. Maggie Bennington Davis from Cascadia provided the keynote address. At that time, the organization I was working for was dealing with a great deal of change. We were in the process of integrating our mental health and chemical health divisions, and we were in the midst of trying to sort out how to integrate these cultures together. And so it was a significant process for us to go through and caused us a great deal of stress in many ways. So when a group of us program directors at this organization heard Dr. Bennington Davis describe the sanctuary model, we got very, very excited about having a model that could help us in our major transition in our organization. And so when you think about your own organizations, be thinking about major changes that are going on or challenges that you might be facing, stressors in the organization, and perhaps how this model might be helpful to you in making changes or transitions. A couple of years later, in 2015, I had the opportunity to fly out to Yonkers, New York, to the Sanctuary Institute, where I went through a week-long training in the sanctuary model, which helped me to understand the model even better. We had spent 2014 going through chapter by chapter a book called Restoring Sanctuary, which helped us to begin to implement the model in the organization that I was in. And so I had a great opportunity for us to implement it in our various programs. Okay, I'm just working at advancing my slides here. There we go. So a little context for sanctuary. And by the way, what I'm really wanting to accomplish in this webinar is to provide a broad overview of the sanctuary model. It requires quite a great deal of learning about the model. And so this is just an opportunity for me to plant some seeds in your minds around what this model is, and perhaps you can begin to think about how this model might be helpful to you. Just a little context of sanctuary. You know, first of all, sanctuary is from the Latin word sanctum, which means sacred place. And so essentially a sanctuary is a safe place where someone can go who is seeking protection from some threat or from some internal threat or external threat to find a place of safety. You know, we're dealing with this in our country with sanctuary cities who are resisting federal immigration efforts to report individuals who are undocumented immigrants to the authorities. And so there is a desire on many people's part to provide sanctuary for those undocumented immigrants as they navigate the immigration system. In our context, what we're referring to is really, however, sanctuary of the soul. What we're looking at providing is for people who have been through traumatic life experiences to be able to come to our organizations and feel a deep sense of safety within our organizations to be able to heal. So a little bit further background about therapeutic communities, because the sanctuary model is essentially based on moral treatment and therapeutic communities. Prior to the 1800s, people with mental illness or people who lived with trauma were treated in some of the most barbaric ways. And it was back in the late 1700s that a physician and a Quaker named Philip Pinnell, who had a close friend and fellow Quaker die in one of these institutions. Philip Pinnell was so appalled by hearing the news of this that he said, we need to be able to do better. And it was there that moral treatment was developed. What he did is he built places outside of the city in areas that was more serene and more safe and more comfortable, where he invited people with serious mental illness to come and live. These individuals were given a safe place to be in very comfortable accommodations with airy rooms and plenty of space, the ability to travel around the grounds, given responsibilities, and given a sense of dignity. And he called it the Friends Retreat that was formed in York, England. Moral treatment came to our country following that, and there was an entire movement of changing the way that we treated people with mental illness. Thomas Kirkbride began to build structures around out in the country, and we then began to have accommodations for people with mental illness that were also provided with dignity and safety. Following that, within the last about 50 or so years ago, a man by the name of Maxwell Jones developed or coined the term therapeutic communities. And these are also places where people with mental illness can come and live, where there are fewer physical restraints used, but much more of a social model of providing safety. Examples of that were Soteria out on the West Coast, Fairweather Lodge, Fountain House in New York, and even places around in the Twin Cities area like Touchstone or even Vale Place are places that are meant to be safe, healthy, and caring environments. So when you think about sanctuary, I'd like you to just take a moment to think about the places that you are, social places that you find yourself, where you feel a sense of absolute safety to be able to be yourself. You know, Henry David Thoreau, over 100 years ago, described that we live with such desperate haste, he called it, in our noisy environment, our fast-paced environment, and our very stressful, oftentimes stressful, even workplaces, where we are rushing around and busy and challenged by all of the work that we need to get done. So I'd like you to think of a safe place for you, maybe with friends or with family, that you could identify as a place that you would think of as being sanctuary. Now imagine a workplace like this, a workplace where you feel when you come to work, you are excited to get to work, a place where you share your ideas and your thoughts about things and you're involved in the decision making. It's a place where you can grieve losses of staff that maybe move on from the organization, or clients that move on, and even clients that die. How are we dealing with these losses? A place where you learn from others, where it's a social learning environment, where there's creative ideas and imagination. A place where you can exercise all of your skills and fulfill the vision for why you actually even went into this workplace. And so although this is probably more of a make-believe place, because there are no perfect organizations. Sandy Bloom, one of the co-founders, perhaps the primary founder of the sanctuary model, says there are no perfect organizations. Few of us have experienced emotionally intelligent environments of perfect safety, where honesty and openness prevail, where there are no secrets, where continuous learning from conflict is the norm, where decisions are routinely made by democratic consensus, balancing individual needs with the common good, where justice is accorded to everyone, or where loss is compassionately understood and honored as a key factor in change, and everyone shares in a drive toward a better future. Well, this is a place that perhaps does not exist, and yet she goes on to say, we can imagine such an organization, or such a society, or even such a world that embodies these kinds of practices. A little history about Sandra Bloom and Brian Faragher, who are collaborated with a few others on developing this model. There is a trilogy of books that have been written by Sandy and Brian that began in 1997 with the book Creating Sanctuary, the subtitle Toward the Evolution of Sane Societies. This is a book where Sandy and her colleagues were coming to understand the prevalence of trauma among her psychiatric patients. Sandy was the medical director of an adult psychiatric unit on the East Coast, where they didn't even realize in the 80s that they weren't addressing trauma. They actually didn't think that their patients were even talking about their trauma. But when they began to read the research, they looked back on their own records and saw that, yes, in fact, the patients were talking about their trauma, but they really didn't have a way to respond to that trauma. And so this was a book written to describe the evolution of understanding how to create sanctuary. The second book in the trilogy, called Destroying Sanctuary, was observations that she made through the 90s and into the 2000 era of the crisis that we were experiencing in our healthcare systems. They began to understand that there were detrimental shifts in healthcare starting in the 90s with managed care, which led to organizations and staff that were experiencing very high levels of stress in their work. The final book in the trilogy, published in 2014, is Restoring Sanctuary. And this is essentially a description of an operating system for trauma-informed systems of care. This includes an in-depth description of the 7 sanctuary commitments, as well as other elements of the sanctuary model. The beginning chapter of this book is called It Starts with a Dream, because in every respect, this all begins with our ability to imagine what type of world, what type of community, and what type of organizations do we really, really want to be a part of. Organizations that are safe, compassionate, and places that are environments that are required for people to heal from trauma. And essentially, this begins with us individually. Sandy and her colleagues use Gandhi's quote about be the change that we want to see in the world, because we're really beginning with our own selves and how we relate with other people. Because embedded in the sanctuary model is that we as providers are really not so different from the clients that we serve. Really, the same things that keep us from changing the situations that we deal with in our work environment may be the very things that keep our clients from making hard changes in their lives. We all have our own habits that we have formed over time and ways of operating that make us reluctant to make changes ourselves. You know, when we talk about a recovery-oriented approach, oftentimes we're asking our clients, so what does recovery mean to you? In the same way, we can ask, what does a healthy, trauma-informed organization mean to us, and how do we live that out? So essentially, sanctuary, according to Sandy Bloom, it's a place of refuge from danger, threat, injury, and fear. She says it's been recognized since ancient times, and scientific research has validated that for physical and emotional healing to occur, people need such a protected space in order to allow time, healers, and the natural powers of recovery to work their magic. So our task or our challenge is to embody sanctuary first ourselves, and then to be able to do that together. A description of the sanctuary model is essentially it is a treatment and organizational change model that integrates trauma theory with the creation of therapeutic communities which provide safety for both clients and the staff who work in them. This is an evidence-supported model, and it stands really apart from other treatment approaches for healing trauma in that both staff and clients utilize and live by and practice the principles of the model. So this is not what we would call a trauma-specific intervention. We may still use our EMDR or sensory motor approaches or therapeutic touch or mindfulness, DBT or cognitive behavioral therapy. We may use all of those trauma-specific interventions while using the sanctuary model as a broad cultural approach to providing a therapeutic community for people to heal, utilizing safety and various principles and tools that are part of the model. So what is described in Sandy Bloom's book, Destroying Sanctuary of the Crisis in Human Services, is the changes that we have experienced in our organizations. Starting up at the top is perhaps one of our greatest challenges is around funding our programs adequately to be able to help people in their healing process. You know, even recently in the news, I heard yesterday that Blue Cross Blue Shield is looking at cutting their payments for therapy by approximately 18%. And this creates a great challenge for us to be able to provide the services. Moving down clockwise, the increased need for paperwork that we experience in order to satisfy our funders that we are actually doing the work that they want us to do. We also experience the stress of staff turnover and doing more work with less staff as well, which creates a whole area, another aspect of stress for us. Managed care in the 90s and increased regulation. I remember back in the 80s, I was the director of a day treatment program in South St. Paul. And actually in Dakota County, there were only 3 case managers back then for all of the people with serious mental illness in the county. But actually it was very easy for them to get them into our program. The funding came through the county, and we were given ample amount of time to work with our clients in this milieu with recreation therapy and occupational therapy over a long period of time, and able to help people to begin to become reintegrated back into the community and find housing and maintain housing. There's also an insufficient availability of resources. For any of you who work in the shelter system, you know how terrible it is to run a lottery for your shelter and invite people back to go back outside in the lottery because there isn't enough community resources, including housing for everybody to be in. The complexity of needs, especially as we work with people with co-occurring mental health and substance use disorders, as well as medical conditions, traumatic brain injury, and add on top of that complex histories of trauma. All of that adds up to the fact that we have a very stressful work for ourselves. And in fact, what can happen is we ourselves can begin to become trauma organized ourselves as we seek to manage all of our own stressors in our own jobs. And so when it comes to change, and when change happens to our environment, without a clear and healthy change model, we ourselves can begin to break down our own communication with each other, and issues can go unresolved in our organization. We ourselves can begin to experience chronic hyperarousal and the impact of that on our own biological and emotional systems. Our leaders are human themselves, and they may begin, if they don't have a model, they may resort to more authoritarian approaches, or even worse, begin to dictate what we will do, how will we do it, and it leads to even more dysfunction within our organizations. And it leads to us not even feeling safe with our own coworkers and colleagues. And so we find ourselves hunkering down in our own offices. We call it encapsulation, where we just go to work and do our jobs. And oftentimes feeling compassion fatigue or vicarious traumatization, or beginning to get burned out with all of these kinds of symptoms ourselves. And so ultimately what happens is we begin to create environments that actually do the opposite of what we intend them to do. Marvel and DC comic books had this whole world called Bizarro World, where those members in that world did the exact opposite of what the good guys were meaning to do. And so we may even shift from a mission to heal to a focus on making money. We shift from a democratic environment to autocratic or dictatorial environments. Healthy communication gives way to a place where we can't be authentic with each other, and communication begins to break down. And so our organizational meetings that we have, the most important thing that takes place at meetings is what's talked about before the meeting and what's after the meeting. And our environments really begin to do the opposite of what we really want to do in our organizations. And so there's this thing called parallel process, which essentially means is that when two systems have significant interaction with each other, they begin to take on the characteristics of each other. Organizations are living and growing and changing systems and have their own unique biology. And therefore, they're every bit as susceptible to stress and strain as are individuals who have experienced trauma. So this complex interaction between the two leads to both clients who feel unsafe and staff who feel unsafe. And so in this slide, you can see what parallel process ends up to be. Clients and staff are all experiencing something very similar, and the organization then becomes unsafe. It can become punitive or stuck, loses its sense of mission, primarily just responding to crisis situations, and essentially become directionless in what it's doing, let alone being able to respond creatively and collaboratively with other organizations. So this is why the sanctuary model is both an organizational change model as well as a treatment approach for the clients, where both clients and staff feel safe working in them. There are essentially 4 pillars of the sanctuary model, beginning with trauma theory, something called the sanctuary commitments, which there are 7 of those. And then there's something called self, which is a fundamental operating tool that is dynamic that we use in working with ourselves, as well as working with the clients that we work with. And then finally, the nuts and bolts of the model around how to attend meetings, or what types of meetings do we have, treatment planning, dealing with crises situations on the unit, so on and so forth, is called the Sanctuary Toolkit. I'm not going to talk much about trauma-informed care because my guess is that most of you have at least had a workshop on trauma-informed care, because it tends to be the topic of our trainings quite a bit these days. I will comment, though, that the ACE study is really significant in helping to understand the number of people who have experienced adverse child experiences. According to the study, over 60% of the population in America have at least one adverse childhood experience. And we know that the more adverse childhood experiences we have, the greater the risk of developing chronic illness, mental health and chemical health disorders, et cetera, et cetera. For example, an ACE study or 4 or more, a person is 700% more likely or at risk of developing a substance use disorder. Another important concept is reenactment. This is essentially where a person is living out the same survival strategies that they used growing up that no longer are effective. I learned this particular quote this last weekend. It is, "In my distrust, I am preparing for some kind of tragic, horrible betrayal that has already happened." Sigmund Freud called it the repetition compulsion. And all of us actually have reenactment. We are all living out the survival strategies that we had in our own, from our own growing up, because none of us had the perfect holding environment in growing up. And so we are all reenacting what we learned, some very, very good habits and patterns, and others that really could stand to be changed. And so this includes varying emotions that really never got metabolized into our system. This particular comic says that this is the barn where we keep our feelings. If a feeling comes to you, bring it out here and lock it up. The idea with sanctuary, or having safe places, is an environment where we can begin to sort through these varied but very much alive emotions, and learn and practice emotional intelligence. The second pillar of the sanctuary model are the 7 sanctuary commitments that are listed around this wheel here. Everyone in the organization is trained in these principles and becomes fully committed to their practice in all interactions. If you're in a nonprofit organization, the board is also aware of these commitments, are trained in these commitments, and practice these commitments. And so it starts with the CEO or the executive director and works its way all the way to someone who is a cook or is a line staff or is somebody who is a janitor within the organization. So everyone is trained in these models. It begins with a commitment to growth and change. This is where we model to clients in our programs that we too are growing and changing. And so this is a movement from reenacting and being stuck in our own reenactment to being becoming aware of our own habits of mind, as well as our habits of how we relate to others. Because we all fall into patterns that over time become unconscious to us. And so being aware of and learning about our own patterns becomes part of the culture within the organization. Secondly is a commitment to democracy. And this is moving from, if we are in some kind of oppressive environment, to everyone participates and takes personal responsibility for the organization. This isn't the same thing as representative government, where we vote somebody in and then everybody votes on a decision that's being made. However, it does mean that major decisions that are made within the organization that affect various workers and individuals, that those workers are they are at the table in the decision-making process. Ultimately, leaders need to make final decisions, but anyone who is significantly or profoundly affected by a decision has a say in the decision-making process. Tools that are needed for the democratic participation are listed here. Expressing oneself, the capacity for deep listening. Everyone's trained in good conflict management skills, how to compromise, self-control, self-discipline, self-respect, and respecting others. And therefore, all of these are taught and modeled in the organization. These tools and these skills actually become part of the curriculum for training staff as well as training clients in these same practices. There's also a commitment to nonviolence, and this is violence in every form. It's called a commitment to satyagraha, which is also called Gandhian nonviolence, where we refuse to retaliate in the same way that someone aggressed against us. This includes microaggressions that get dealt with, that every behavior that is of a violent nature, even the microaggressions, is addressed whenever it emerges in the organization, regardless of who practiced this behavior. And this includes emails and every other form of communication. And so everyone learns to manage conflict productively. Next is a commitment to emotional intelligence. And this is moving from a dysregulation of emotions, or what we call chronic organizational hyperarousal, or flooding, where our respiration is high, our heart rate is up over 100 when we're reacting to something, our amygdala is firing, danger, danger. And we move to an ability to respond with emotional intelligence to that crisis situation. It is interesting, as these authors say, that emotions are oftentimes the primary determinants of behavior at work, and profoundly influence both the social climate and the productivity of companies and organizations. And yet oftentimes, when we are stressed, we stop talking about emotions and we simply start acting out these emotions. And so everyone understands, and especially leaders, that a key part of their job is to recognize, contain, and manage emotions in the organization, and actually not just manage, but seek out others that may have reacted emotionally or adversely to some situation. Commitment to social learning. This is all about what Peter Senge, the organizational guru, talks about in his book, The Fifth Discipline, about learning organizations, is that we become a creative learning environment where we're all committed to learning. And it's not just top-down directing, but everyone is part of this creative process. the learning organization is where we really can adapt to all of the changes that are coming around, because there are so many changes that we face in our workplace. And I don't know if you've ever been in a work environment that is called a learning organization, but you will always remember it if you have, where you're sitting around a table being creative, feeling free to express your ideas and your opinions. Sure, there's conflict and there's disagreement, but it all becomes part of the way that we learn. And so again, it's a commitment to social learning. The sixth commitment is open communication. There are no longer secrets in the organization, but there's interpersonal transparency. Certainly there is privacy. I know there's times when if somebody is, for example, fired from an organization, there is certain privacy, but nonetheless, what happens around that and people's emotions, people have an opportunity to gather together to talk about what is the decisions that are being made or the changes that are happening in the organization. And we use our words as much as possible to communicate directly and not just acting out our emotions. Leaders are especially responsible not just to handle dissent, but actually search for it and find out from their staff what would be wrong with this decision if we were to make this decision. It is really allowing us to talk about the undiscussables. The final commitment is to social responsibility. This is moving from what's called the reciprocity rule, which is where we react as the other did and expect the other to do as you did, to a commitment to balancing individual rights and the responsibilities with the rights and responsibilities of the community. Our organizations need to make money. We have certain standards that we need to meet and so forth. And at the same time, we have a living, breathing staff who also need care and who also need to experience a sense of accountability and a sense of rights. And so it's balancing those things out. So there are these three forms of justice, which are called distributive justice, procedural justice, and interactional justice. All of these are being balanced out. So that's the seventh one, is of the 7 sanctuary commitments. And again, everyone is committed to these commitments. And it's not just a set of rules that are hung up on the wall. These are commitments that we make to each other and to our own work. Okay, so the third pillar of the sanctuary model is called, this acronym called SELF. This is our fundamental operating tool. It's very dynamic, and it includes these 4 components, which is safety, emotion, loss, and future. This is a way of managing and organizing complexity, because the clients that we work with are extremely complex in the symptoms and set of trauma symptoms, as well as mental illness, substance use, behavioral challenges are very complex. And so we use this operating tool to help us to manage this complexity. It is not linear in the sense that we start with one letter and move on to the next, but it's very dynamic. And we use this SELF model in all of our treatment planning and in many of our meetings that we have together, where we are discussing the crises, situations, or challenges that we face, particularly as we ourselves get stuck or as our clients get stuck. And so it's also an easily accessible language that we all can be on the same page, both staff and clients, around how we are managing our recovery or how our clients are moving through their healing process. So it gets us all on the same page and gives us a common language. The first part of that is safety. And there are 4 different forms of safety that we speak of. Of course, physical safety, this is a primary factor. And we still do see where restraints are used in our hospital systems, and there is still staff who are being injured by patients who are aggressive. So we are all striving towards an environment that focuses in on safety for everyone. Psychological safety I'm going to cover on the next slide. Social safety is where we feel safe with each other, including a lack of no microaggressions towards each other, or that they are processed as they occur. And then moral and ethical safety as well. Psychological safety encompasses all of these aspects of safety. And when we are able to go inside ourselves in our own work that we're doing and feel a sense of safety with ourselves, we feel a greater sense of confidence that we can speak out in situations in our organizations and have a voice in our organizations because we have a sense of these qualities of feeling safe with ourselves. Next is the E part of the self model, which is emotions. This is one angry baby. And every once in a while, all of us can feel that kind of anger. And learning how to manage this anger is obviously essential. Our clients that come to us who have been traumatized may come in with a great deal of unresolved anger and project that onto us. And so we provide psychoeducation both to staff and to residents or clients around managing their emotions. And as a staff, we model how to manage our emotions to them. Next is grieving losses. I love this Russian proverb because it encompasses really our work. Is that when you live next to the cemetery, you can't cry for everyone who dies. Well, the fact is that learning how to manage losses, learning how to manage grief is a big part of our work because our clients come to us with so many unresolved losses that we must begin to develop a language of how to support people in their grieving process. And we learn that by practicing ourselves how we are apprentices of sorrow in our own lives and within our own organizations. And so it includes grieving, how to say goodbye. I've been a part of many organizations where staff move on and our clients are left with the transition of having a new case manager. How do we do that together? Are we allowing time to be able to say our goodbyes and to do that well without reenacting a survival strategy of blaming somebody for abandoning us or just simply shutting down and not dealing with the emotions associated with the loss. And there's also moving on and letting go. And so in our treatment planning, as we talk about losses, how is somebody actually dealing with losses? And perhaps that's the area that they might be getting stuck on, is managing some form of loss. The fourth part of this self-model is future. And this is all about having a recovery vision, where we see new possibilities, making alternative choices to what we've always done. Because if we always do what we've always done, we're always going to get what we always got. And so it's having vision and imagination. And I know many clients that I've worked with in the past, it's taken a while to develop a recovery orientation or a sense of what is possible in the future. But that is part of our treatment approach, is how do we help somebody to develop a sense of hope for the future and a sense of possibility. So that is the self model, and what we do is that we use, when we do our treatment planning, we use any of these four aspects, or all of these four aspects, when we do treatment planning, which I'm going to talk about in just a second. So the fourth pillar of the sanctuary model is the sanctuary toolkit, and that includes a variety of things. First of all is what's called the self-treatment planning conference. And how do we run one? Well, first of all, our treatment planning begins with the question, what happened to you instead of what's wrong with you? We are always keeping the dynamic and the principle of reenactment in the forefront. Understanding to what extent are you learning about how you are reenacting an old pattern, an old survival strategy that is no longer beneficial to the relationships and the future that you want now. Also in these planning conferences, much more time is focused on the solution than it is the problem. All attendees that are gathered together in this treatment planning conference are expected to participate in giving information and posing questions. It's not just the team leader or the psychiatrist or everyone that is relevant to this person's treatment planning is part of this process. So this treatment planning process helps to foster a shared language using the self model for understanding where a person is at in terms of their healing process. It helps us to organize how we talk about treatment. It keeps the focus on trauma and reenactment and learning a new way of responding to social and situations out in the environment. It continues a focus on growth and change that is part of the future aspect of the self model. So other aspects of the sanctuary model toolkit are community meetings, for example. In community meetings, every meeting that starts out, all the way from the board of directors meeting to treatment planning meetings, to psychoeducation groups, to consultation groups, begins with a community meeting. And what that is essentially three questions. The questions are, how are you feeling? What is your goal for this meeting? And who will help you? It's a simple go-around where everyone answers those three questions. And what this does is it brings emotion into the room and acknowledges that emotion is a big part of our process of healing. It also helps everyone in the room to describe what their goal is for that meeting and why it is that they are wanting what they want to accomplish in that meeting. And then it connects all of us in a social, learning, environmental way of who will help you in accomplishing your goal. It puts us all on the same page and sets an atmosphere of social responsibility and collaboration and a democratic process. Psychoeducation groups are all about the things that I've already mentioned around self-skills and abilities and emotional intelligence. Red flag meetings are when there is a crisis that happens in the organization. Perhaps there is some physical violence, or perhaps there's tensions are rising in the unit or in the house or in the treatment facility. As tensions are rising, anyone can call a red flag meeting, which helps to address what is going on, and it helps to look at developing strategies to either prevent something worse from happening, or what happened in this meeting or in this crisis, and not to blame anyone, but simply to talk about what happened and how can we move forward. Out of that meeting, everyone is given a certain task or responsibility to address the problem, and a date is set for a follow-up meeting to see how the planning or how the implementation of that plan went. I talked about self-care planning. There are team meetings that follow the community meeting approach, as well as how we do team meetings. that follow the 7 sanctuary commitments. And ultimately, there's also treatment planning conferences, which I guess I talked about, and then safety plans. Everyone in the organization has a safety plan, and they actually wear it, depending upon the type of environment you're in. You wear it on a card, similar to just a card like this, that you wear around on a lanyard that says, this is what I do when I am not feeling safe. I may talk to a colleague, I may seek supervision, I may go for a walk, or some other approach to managing stress. All clients have one of these, and all staff wear one of these. And so these safety plans are focused on self-care. That really begins with a sense of self-love and nurture and care for ourselves, which self-care is essential and so important within the sanctuary model, because if we are not feeling safe or managing our own emotions around stress, then we certainly are not going to be available to our clients to be able to manage stress as well. So to summarize, is that this is obviously calling for deep-rooted change, both in ourselves, the commitments we make to how we relate to others, to how our organizations work, and incorporating an approach to working with our clients. It essentially means creating a therapeutic community of safe places, not just with principles that hang on a wall, but as a culture shift in how we are as an organization. So it is a treatment and organizational change model that integrates what we know from trauma theory and therapeutic communities, creating safety for staff and clients, including trauma theory, 7 sanctuary commitments, the fundamental operating tool of self, and the sanctuary toolbox. So I think that's all I have for you when we're approaching our time, but we may have some time for questions. Joe?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Carlson. If anyone does have any questions in the next few minutes, please submit them through the chat box below. And we do have one. Nia asks, what do you suggest when the organization or local government entity has a negative history with another entity, yet many members on both sides are attempting to develop a program where there's a history of many losses and long-standing grudges?
You know, I've been in organizations where we have these kinds of experiences. And I think as we develop within ourselves the capacity to have a voice, and then we collaborate with other people on a similar developing these tools and skills, is that we begin to pull together and sit down and really to have an open communication and meeting. I would suggest being able to learn about these 7 sanctuary commitments, learn about those, and then become kind of advocates of all of us developing these commitments. Because this isn't just good for ourselves and for our clients. This is good for our collaborative relationships with our referral sources, with those that we make referrals to, with those that we collaborate with for mental health and chemical health treatment. And it's also good for our world. In our current political climate, we know that we see all of the violence and destructive ways of responding to each other. So this becomes a way that we relate really to everybody. And so I would suggest, I would actually suggest starting with this book here, Restoring Sanctuary, reading about the 7 sanctuary commitments, and beginning to embrace those within a small group of people.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dr. Carlson. That is all the questions we have for now. On behalf of the Minnesota Center for Chemical and Mental Health, we'd like to thank you all for attending, wish you a happy and safe weekend, and special thanks to Dr. Steve Carlson for his wonderful presentation.
Thank you.